Last Wednesday, we began studying the pleasures of the Sabbath day. We looked at why the Sabbath is so important, why we need to prepare for the Sabbath, why we need to learn how to keep the Sabbath. We looked at some of the things to do on the preparation day, and this evening we're going to cover things that we are not to do on the Sabbath first, and then we're going to finish off today's study with what are we supposed to be doing on the Sabbath. The reason I find that there's so many things not to do on the Sabbath is because if we did them, we would never have time to do the things we're supposed to do on the Sabbath day. We already covered last week, and we'll start with this one here with Eden. You can read Exodus 16, verse 23. We looked at not to do any cooking and baking on the Sabbath, so let's read Exodus 16, 23. It's up there on the screen. You can just read it right away from the screen, please.
And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and seethe that you will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. Okay, so we learned last week that the seething is simply boiling, so basically cooking. So basically that on the preparation day, you are to do all your cooking and your baking, and then you are to keep the rest of it for Sabbath, and that's what you are going to do. And of course, we learned that on any other day of the week, you were to gather the food together, but you could not it could not keep it to the next day. You can only keep it for the Sabbath day. Now, associated with no cooking, you also had not to kindle a fire. Let's look at Exodus 35, verse 2 and 3. Ellen? Just go ahead and read it right from there so we can move quickly here.
6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you an holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. Ye shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day.
So throughout Israel, they were not to make a fire. A fire was not to be done on the Sabbath day. Now, what about in wintertime? What happens when it's cold? Can you light a fire when it's cold? Or are you supposed to stay in a frozen environment? Well, keep in mind in the wilderness, it never did get cold. Why not? Do you remember why not? The pillar of fire was there. Okay, there was no need for it. It's not like when you get to the promised land, you didn't have the pillar of fire. And this is why in Pictures from Prophets, Brother Duarte, please read it so people can hear you.
Okay. During the sojourn in the wilderness, the kindling of fires upon the seventh day had been strictly prohibited. The prohibition was not to extend to the land of Canaan, where the severity of the climate would often render fires a necessity. But in the wilderness, fire was not needed for warmth.
Okay, so in the wilderness, you had the pillar of fire. You did not need it for warmth. Therefore, that was not necessary. And when you get to the land of Canaan, yes, the severity of the weather needed to kindle a fire. But that did not apply to the wilderness. So in the wilderness, there was no need to kindle a fire. Associated with not kindling a fire comes something else. Hudson.
And while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron and unto all the congregation.
So here you find a man, he was gathering sticks. What was he gathering sticks for? Okay, you're gathering sticks for a fire. Why was that? They didn't know what to do with this man. And it goes on. Do you want to read next? He can read. He can read in English, I know that.
Y lo pusieron en la cárcel porque no estaba declarado qué le había de hacer. 36 también. Entonces los sacó la congregación fuera del campo y lo apedrearon con piedras y murió como Jehová había mandado a Moisés.
Okay, now let's read it in English.
So verse 35, and the Lord said unto Moses, the man shall be surely put to death.
Start with verse 34.
Oh yes. And they put him in ward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with the stones without the camp.
All right, so first they didn't know what to do, so they put him in ward, and they said, what to do with this man? And it said, he shall surely be put to death. Brother Joe, if you'd like to read the next one there.
Yes. It ain't on yet. I gotta go up here.
Microphone up.
And all the congregation brought him without the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord commanded Moses.
So why was this man put to death? He was out there gathering stones. There was obviously no reason to sticks, there was no reason for him to be gathering sticks. So why did that happen, Karina?
The act of this man was a willful and deliberate violation of the fourth commandment, a sin, not of thoughtlessness or ignorance, but of presumption.
All right, so this was quite a different situation. It was not ignorance. If I'm not mistaken, it was after they were told they cannot enter the promised land because they refused to go to start with, okay, and they had a lot of problems there, and so they were now to spend 40 years in the wilderness, and this was a man getting angry at God. And so he went out there and decided to go pick up some sticks, okay, and he knew he should not be picking up sticks, but he went out there to go pick up sticks anyway, and that was a deliberate violation. Most of the time, I try most of the time to use a wood-burning stove at home. Okay, during the winter time, I try to avoid the other things. The last couple years, I haven't had one, but I'm working hard, so hopefully this winter I'll have my wood again. And every Friday, I used to bring all the wood near the door, fill up the part there in the house as much as I can and put it near the door so I don't have to even go gather it somewhere else. Because why? Because it's the Sabbath. We're trying not to do any of those type of things. So again, in the wilderness, it was not necessary at all because they had the pillar of fire by night. That was not needed. And so when this man did this, it was a willful violation of the law of God. Sister Susie, the next part here, clearly no work at all.
You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Every one that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people.
So clearly no work is to be done. We need to make sure that all our secular work is put aside. And it's interesting, there are very important periods in the year. Eden, if you can start again there. Exodus 34, verse 21.
6 days thou shalt work, but on the seventh day thou shalt rest. In earing time and in harvest thou shalt rest.
All right, so when you're working in agriculture, and most of their work was agriculture, their economy was agricultural economy. And in agriculture, you have to plant when it's time to plant, seed when it's time to seed, harvest when it's time to harvest. And it's interesting, I was told when communism came in, they took away all the farms. And in Yugoslavia, they took away all the farms, and everyone worked on a collective farm. And it was clearly told, none of this is yours. And so they are out there, they've done their 8-hour shift, and they look up and the rain is coming. And what do? Well, their 8-hour shift is done, they go home. And so they went home, and the next day, that night it poured down rain, and they got out there in the middle of the rain the next morning to do their 8-hour shift. And the tractor got stuck, and they spent 8 hours pulling the tractor out. Okay, and Tito realized very quickly, the president of the country realized quickly that this type of communism is not going to work. They're going to starve, and surely they did not have a very good harvest that year. So then he introduced the idea of small farms. You can do small farming. And obviously, when it's your farm, your land, what do you do? When you feel that it is your own, what happens? When you see that the rain is coming, what do? You work all night if you have to. I grew up in farm country in California. When it's time to plant, you see those tractors out there day and night. When it's harvest time in the rice, we were in the middle of the rice fields, and you see the rice fields, they're harvesting day and night. We sometimes had to do it. Ours was a vegetable farm in the midst of all of that. And sometimes, yes, we had to work all night long. But there was one thing. Even as important as planting and harvesting time is, what are you to do on the Sabbath? You're to stop. You see, they were to stop doing that on Sabbath because the Sabbath was so important that you had to put that even in that important period of time, you needed to take a rest. Clearly no business operations whatsoever. Ellen? Nehemiah 10, verse 31.
And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and that we would leave the 7th year and the exaction of every debt.
All right, so here you had what? These people of the land, they came to sell their wares, their different things on the Sabbath day. And Nehemiah was very clear, we are not going to buy anything on the Sabbath day. That's because we have respect for the Sabbath. And here we have an example. Let's see here, Daphne, if you can read that. It's a couple of slides, 2-3 slides, so if you can just read those.
In those days I saw in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, and also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus, and did not your God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified it against them, and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy.
You have quite an example here of what they tried to do, and Nehemiah made sure that this is not going to happen. And so notice here, he put the Levites to be in charge of the gates. Before the Sabbath began, before the setting of the sun, before it became dark, he had them in charge to make sure no one is there around the gates. And it's interesting that before the Levites could enforce the law of God, what had to happen? What had to happen before one can enforce the law of God? Did you notice there in this verse? What's the first thing they had to do? They had to cleanse themselves. That's correct. You see, they have to cleanse themselves. And this is why when we're talking about, even in the church, when we're looking at dealing with some sins in the church, those who see what's happening, before they deal with it, they need a reconversion. Yeah, they need a reconversion experience. They need a cleansing themselves, because you can't do it properly unless you have that kind of cleansing. Clearly no bearing of the burdens on Sabbath, Rose?
Thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. Neither carry forth a burden out of your house on the Sabbath day, neither do ye any work, but hallow ye the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers.
So clearly no burdens to be borne on the Sabbath day. That's not something that we are to carry it. Sometimes people think, okay, I'm not going to buy this, but can you please carry this for me on the Sabbath? And I'll pay for it later. Okay, that's exactly the same thing as doing this. So it says carry no burdens on the Sabbath. There's also something called a Sabbath day's journey, Brother Duarte. This is Acts chapter 1 and verse 12. Acts chapter 1, verse 12.
Then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey.
Okay, so here's something called a Sabbath day's journey. So that means that when we are looking at traveling, we need to consider carefully how to travel on the Sabbath hours. Hudson, if you want to read, it's a couple of slides there.
If we desire the blessing promised to the obedient, we must observe the Sabbath more strictly. I fear that we often travel on this day when it might be avoided. In harmony with the light which the Lord has given in regard to the observance of the Sabbath, we should be more careful about traveling on the boats or cars on this day. In these matters, we should set a right example before our children and youth, in order to reach the churches that need our help and to give them the message that God desires them to hear. It may be necessary for us to travel on Sabbath. But so far as possible, we should secure our tickets and make all necessary arrangements some other day. When starting on the journey, we should make every possible effort to plan so as to avoid reaching our destination on the Sabbath.
All right, so this is very clear here. So, the travel is not just like nothing. I'm not doing any work, I'm just driving. No, we have to be very careful here. Now, a lot of time, in this case, they weren't even driving. They were going on boats. They were traveling on a train. And today we have our own vehicles. We have we go by airplane. Those are all things that we do, and sometimes it is necessary for us to travel on the Sabbath to reach the churches, especially that need our help. But we need to make all necessary arrangements to purchase tickets, to do it on another day. We should make every possible effort to plan so as to avoid reaching our destination on the Sabbath. And so, most of the time we're flying places. And I have seen, as I mentioned last week, many times when I travel, on Friday, there's going to be nothing but trouble whenever I travel on Friday. Every time I travel on Friday, something is a problem, okay? And I've watched a lot of people, a lot of our brethren, they arrive, a plane delays, and next thing you know, they have to travel on Sabbath. And those are all unnecessary if you make the appropriate planning. And not only that, when you're traveling on Sabbath, what happens? You get all frustrated. You know that you shouldn't be doing this, so you get all tensed up and everything else. And I see people constantly as a nervous wreck because they're constantly running into problems. And I avoided most of those problems by not traveling on Friday. When I'm talking about when I'm going overseas, to try to arrive there on Thursday night, And many times I planned to arrive on Thursday and I ended up on Friday. Why? Because there was a delay in the plane or something happened. And I was not frustrated. I was relaxed because I still had plenty of time. There have been times that I remember in one place, it was actually in the Philippines, and we were, the flight was about an hour, maybe 2-hour flight, and we had to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning for the flight. And we arrived there, and We were waiting for our flight. It got delayed and delayed and delayed until the sun was almost set on Friday. So here we are all day long at that airport in Manila. And finally, we take our flight and we arrive on Sabbath over there. I wasn't very happy with that. Next time I was in the Philippines, I told the brethren, no, we're going on Thursday. Thursday night. I'm not doing this Friday thing anymore. This is just not right. I can't handle that anymore. And sure enough, the flights were delayed and you still had all sorts of problems. So when you know there are situations like that, some places, I remember, when I was in Angola one time, we were down where the missionary school was, and we were flying back to Luanda, the capital. And I was there in the morning, a couple hours before the flight was leaving, and I can see the sign that says boarding. The flight was already boarding. The problem was it was boarding till 10 o'clock that night. And I looked outside, there was no airplane there. Even one person, he came to the airport and he was just a few minutes before the flight, and they said, sorry, you can't get on because you see, we're already boarding. And he really made a big stink with them, and they finally let him in, and he had to wait another 7, 8 hours, 9 hours before the flight left. So that's in some countries. Those are things that you already know are going to happen. And it is no longer an issue. This was not a Sabbath. It was another day that I was flying. And so I could be there at the airport a little bit more relaxed because the Sabbath is not a problem. So we need to make those arrangements. We also have to consider our words, the type of words that you use. Brother Joe.
If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words.
So this is very clear here that among the other things that we need to make sure that it's not just our words. We need to look at what are we talking about on Sabbath. Sabbath, we need to be considerate of our words. So now, as I mentioned earlier, the reason there's so many things not to do is because there are things we need to be doing in order to keep the Sabbath properly. Keep in mind what the purpose of the Sabbath is. Karina? Isaiah 58 and verse 12.
And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in.
That means that there is something for us to build up when we're talking about Sabbath keeping. Verse 14, Sister Susie.
Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it.
So here it says then, so in the context of Sabbath keeping, it's talking about enjoying the Lord. That means the Sabbath is something that needs to be enjoyed. Now, can you enjoy something if you're unconscious? Can you enjoy something if, actually before we go to this part here, let's understand the purpose of the Sabbath itself. Why did God create the Sabbath? Johnson.
And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath.
So when God made the Sabbath, he made it for man. He made it to bless us. Now, it's impossible to receive the blessing of God and the enjoyment of God if we are unconscious. So Ellen, if you'd like to read the next one here, from volume 6, 357.
Let not the precious hours of the Sabbath be wasted in bed. On Sabbath morning the family should be astir early. If they rise late, there is confusion and bustle in preparing for breakfast and Sabbath school. There is hurrying, jostling, and impatience. Thus unholy feelings come into the house. The Sabbath thus desecrated becomes a weariness, and its coming is dreaded rather than loved.
So what we find here is that the Sabbath when we're talking about Sabbath as a day of rest, we are not talking here about physically resting, okay, and spending all our time to lay down. That's not what we're talking about. It's a refreshment type of rest that we're to be having, to go away from the burdens of life and refreshing ourselves in the Lord. That's its purpose. And this is why, when we're talking about going to church on Sabbath, we need to be there, plan to be there early. Because if you're late, what happens? What happens when you're late? There's hurrying, there's jostling, there's impatience. And what happens then? There is unholy feelings come up, isn't there? Those are things that come up. And so the Sabbath becomes a weariness. And it's dreaded rather than loved. And this is why when we're talking about going to church, I have always stated, if you plan to be on time, you're going to be late. Okay, it's simple as that. If you're looking at 9:30 and you're looking at how many minutes it takes for me to get to church, you are going to be late. I can guarantee you that. And so to me, in my life, I have simply I added a half hour to what I need. A half hour. I started when I was a teenager. Even when I didn't have my driver's license, okay? I was 14 years old. My brother was driving me to church, okay? He was 16, so he had a driver's license. What time we got to leave? And I always added, we were about half an hour from church. And, to me, we have to leave at 8:30. And he just doesn't get it. Why do we have to leave at 8:30? If we have to pick up my grandparents, it's at 8:15 we got to leave. And he doesn't understand it. And every single week, we never got late to church, but we never got there. If we left at 8:30, we weren't there at 9. I can guarantee you that. Why? Because there was always something, a hang-up. Sometimes there's a accident on the road. Sometimes there's other issues on the road. There's always something. And yet we were able to go to church calmly. And my brother always, we got here early. Well, that's okay. It's better early than late. But we were never late. We were never late. And most of the time we got there, we did get there many times when the gate was closed at the church. I mean, I understand that. But we didn't wait too long before the usher came in and unlocked the gate. We'd be parked outside there. But you learn that, and it's nice when you have a key too, so you can come here and I have a key and I can open it. That's really nice. But to be able to get there, and most of the time we're never that early, okay? But you planned for it. We need to understand the purpose of the Sabbath. Let us understand why God has the Sabbath. Eden? Leviticus 23 and verse 3.
6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, an holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings.
It's interesting, this passage here. It does not say the Sabbath is to be devoted for gatherings. I don't know, you're looking at me, but did you notice this? The Sabbath is not just for a gathering. It's not just for a convocation. What is it? It's to go where? Notice here, to a holy convocation. And I mention this because a lot of people, they tell me how terrible it is to go to church. They have to witness this, this, and this, and this, but you have to go there. No. It's where? You have to go to a place that you consider what? A holy convocation. Let's take a look at these things here. What we are to be actually doing. Brother Lee, this is from Early Writings 124 and 125. Go ahead.
The different parties of professed Adventist believers have each a little truth, but God has given all these truths to His children who are being prepared for the day of God. He has also given them truth that none of these parties know, neither will they understand.
So it's interesting here. It talks about different groups of Advent believers. These are people that believe in the second coming of Christ. And each of them have what? A little truth. This one has some truth. That one has some truth. Each of these have some truth. But God has given what? All the truths where? To His children. You see. And matter of fact, these other groups, they're just not going to understand some of the truths that have been given to God's children. Brother Duarte. So here we find that, they're just not going to understand that. Why not?
Things which are sealed up to them, the Lord has opened to those who will see and are ready to understand. If God has any new light to communicate, He will let His chosen and beloved understand it, without their going to have their minds enlightened by hearing those who are in darkness and error.
So here, there are things that are sealed up to them they cannot understand. They won't understand. And so if God has any new light to communicate, He will communicate it to His people. We don't have to go searching everywhere where there's a little bit of truth here, a little bit of truth there, to see in case we're going to find something. Daphne, if you want to continue, it's, I think, 2 slides, yeah.
I was shown the necessity of those who believe that we are having the last message of mercy, being separate from those who are daily embidding new errors. I saw that neither young nor old should attend their meetings, for it is wrong to thus encourage them while they teach error that is a deadly poison to the soul, and teach that for doctrines the commandments of men. The influence of such gatherings is not good. If God has delivered us from such darkness and error, we should stand fast in the liberty wherewith He has set us free, and rejoice in the truth. God is displeased with us when we go to listen to error without being obliged to go.
One more.
For unless He sends us to those meetings where error is forced home to the people by the power of the will, He will not keep us. The angels cease their watchful care over us, and we are left to the buffetings of the enemy, to be darkened and weakened by him in the power of his evil angels, and the light around us becomes contaminated with the darkness.
That's why it's so important to go to what? To a holy convocation. Not just any convocation, but a holy convocation. Why? Because God wants us to be separate from those who are daily imbibing new errors. Yes, we are to be witnessing to people in error. Yes, we are to be witnesses to the world. But on Sabbath, we need to be refreshed. And we get refreshed how? By listening to the truth. And this is why neither young nor old should attend their meetings. You encourage people who are teaching error if you go to those meetings. We need to be spending our time together in rejoicing in the truth. And unless God has a special mission for us to go to some of these places, He's not going to keep us. And what's going to happen to the light around us? It becomes what? Contaminated with the darkness. That's how dangerous that is. There have been times I had to go in some of these places, and I have specifically made sure that when I'm going there, some people know that I'm going there, and they're praying for me while I'm going there. Because it can be quite dangerous. And I've seen some very dangerous things over the years, spiritually speaking, and I thank the Lord that I had somebody there that was praying for me. We also need to understand that it is important to do things that are good on the Sabbath day. Brother Joe, I think it's 2 slides here. Matthew 12, 10 to 13.
And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? how much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Then said he to the man, stretch forth thine hand, and he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other.
Christ could have healed this man any other day. Christ knew where he was, actually. But we find here that Christ specifically healed him on the Sabbath day. Keep in mind that Jesus did not have a lineup on Sabbath. He didn't sit there and say, okay, everybody that needs to be healed, come over here. No, but there were certain cases when he saw somebody suffering, he made it very clear it was, you can do well on the Sabbath day. Is it possible, if there's someone's in the medical profession, to violate the Sabbath? Karina. Medical Ministry, page 50.
There will always be duties which have to be performed on the Sabbath for the relief of suffering humanity. This is right, and in accordance with the law of him who says, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. But there is danger of falling into carelessness on this point, and of doing that which is not positively essential to do on the Sabbath.
So here's the danger. Yes, we need to relieve suffering, but at the same time, we can fall into carelessness on this point. And so we have a warning to physicians.
He is in danger of becoming confused and of failing to see the elevated, holy influence which the Sabbath question is to exert on the work for this time. He will consider it necessary to do on the Sabbath many things which should not be done on that day. If he seeks to embrace so many responsibilities, he will come to pay very little regard to the Sabbath.
So here's a warning to physicians. And what's the warning? That there are many things that especially if they gather too many responsibilities, they need to understand that the Sabbath is such day. And what's going to happen if such a person is leading an institution, Brandon?
Such an influence will be a curse to the institution. Those who are connected with our sanitariums are to be taught to regard the Sabbath question as the great test for this time. God desires his people to bind medical missionary work up with the work of the third angel's message. This is the work that will restore the moral image of God in man.
So we need to clearly understand the responsibilities of Sabbath keeping. And what's the danger that you find there? Johnson, I think it's 2 slides.
Those who, from whatever cause, are obliged to work on the Sabbath are always in peril. They feel the loss, and from doing works of necessity, they fall into the habit of doing things on the Sabbath that are not necessary. The sense of its sacredness is lost, and the holy commandment is of no effect. A special effort should be made to bring about a reform in regard to Sabbath observance. The workers in the sanatorium do not always do for themselves what is their privilege and duty. Often they feel so weary that they become demoralized. This should not be. The soul can be rich in grace only as it shall abide in the presence of God.
Sometimes we can be working so hard for the Lord like the devil. And unfortunately, we end up with the devil's blessing because we become what? Demoralized. So we need to evaluate that very carefully. So let's take a look and see what things we need to look at. Ellen, it's a couple of slides here. So let's take a look at this from volume 7, 106.
Often physicians and nurses are called upon during the Sabbath to minister to the sick, and sometimes it is impossible for them to take time for rest and for attending devotional services. The needs of suffering humanity are never to be neglected. The Savior, by his example, has shown us that it is right to relieve suffering on the Sabbath. But unnecessary work, such as ordinary treatments and operations that can be postponed, should be deferred. Let the patients understand that the physicians and helpers should have one day for rest. Let them understand that the workers fear God and desire to keep holy the day that he has set apart for his followers, to observe as a sign between him and them.
So very clearly that we are never to neglect the needs of suffering humanity. We are to relieve suffering. That is what we need to be doing as a people. But notice here, unnecessary work. Clearly, like ordinary treatments and operations, what should happen? They should be postponed. Why? Because physicians and helpers have 1 day for rest. I remember when I had some surgery, I was in a car accident, and they had to do some plastic surgery there to repair some of the things. And after the surgery, my first time, right immediately after the accident, they took me on surgery on Friday night, and I had the surgery on Friday night. And I was where the accident happened was in a country hospital out in New South Wales, and they could only do so much. And when I went to the big city of Adelaide, they took one look at me and scheduled surgery immediately. And it was that night, and it was Friday night. And I said, well, can that be postponed? And he says, no, your tissue is dead. Okay, we got to remove that. So I went Friday night, and I had my surgery. About a year later, I had follow-up surgery. I was back home in Maryland at the time, and I went to George Washington University Hospital. And they did surgery there. They had to re-break my nose, and I don't know, a whole bunch of other stuff there. It was a big work there. And I had to have a follow-up visit. And the follow-up visit, according to so many days, should have been on Friday. And the doctor said, no, you need to come on Saturday. And I said, wait a minute, why? I can come on Friday, or well, we don't have room Friday, but Saturday. But what about Sunday? He says, no, that's my golfing day. Well, I said that this is not an emergency. He says, okay. So he arranged it that I can visit another doctor on Sunday, because it was no problem at that point. So we took consider, even when we're making things, there was no need to have an ordinary checkup on Sabbath. That was not necessary. I could do that on Sunday just as well as I could on Sabbath. We need to understand that physicians need a day of rest. Again, keep in mind, there is a problem, and I think this is also a couple slides there. Eden? Still from volume 7.
A spirit of irreverence and carelessness in the observance of the Sabbath is liable to come into our sanitariums. Upon the men of responsibility in the medical missionary work rests the duty of giving instruction to physicians, nurses, and helpers in regard to the sanctity of God's holy day. Especially should every physician endeavor to set a right example. The nature of his duties naturally leads him to feel justified in doing on the Sabbath many things that he should refrain from doing. So far as possible, he should so plan his work that he can lay aside his ordinary duties.
So we find here that there are many things that he needs to evaluate. Those who are in the medical work need to evaluate what can be done on Sabbath, what needs to be done, and what doesn't need to be, so that we can receive the blessings that God has for us on Sabbath, especially Sabbath services. Brother Lee, in volume 4, it goes there and explains some things here. Volume 4, 539.
Some have made a serious mistake in neglecting to attend the public worship of God. The privileges of the divine services will be as beneficial to them as to others, and are fully as essential. They may be unable to avail themselves of these privileges as often as to many others. Physicians will frequently be called upon the Sabbath to visit the sick and may be obliged to make it a day of exhausting labor. Physicians will frequently be called upon the Sabbath to visit the sick and may be obliged to make it a day of exhausting labor. Such labor to relieve the suffering was pronounced by our Savior as a work of mercy and no violation of the Sabbath. But those who regularly devote their Sabbath to writing or labor, making no special change, harm their own souls, give to others an example that is not worthy of imitation, and do not honor God.
So we see the struggle that the people may have, and it's clear to understand you need to take time, especially for public worship. It's an important thing, and especially after COVID, a lot of people tend to stay home and think it's just, I'm listening to the sermon. It's not listening just to the sermon, it's the public interaction that you have with each other that is critical here, and that's also important for those who are physicians. Now, sometimes, obviously, what happens with the money that they receive while working on the Sabbath? What should they do with that, Brother Duarte? If we can have the, the row that we're going through, so make sure they have the thing ready.
Physicians need to cultivate a spirit of self-denial and self-sacrifice. It may be necessary to devote even the hours of the Holy Sabbath to the relief of suffering humanity, but the fee for such labor should be put into the treasury of the Lord, to be used for the worthy poor, who need medical skill but cannot afford to pay for it.
So what we find here is that they still are to receive the fee, but that fee is not theirs because it was on the Sabbath. What should they do with the fee? There should be a place in the treasury, that a special fund that is to be used to help the worthy poor to have medical skill. They cannot afford it, but to give them and help them pay for that medical skill. In reality, what should we be doing? Because this is such a challenging thing, Hudson.
The faithful physician needs the sympathy and prayers of the people of God.
Don't you think that? We need to be praying for those who are physicians because they have a very challenging thing to meet with in this regard. Also, there's something else that is really important on the Sabbath. Daphne?
For they that dwell at Jerusalem and their rulers, because they knew him not, nor yet the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath day, they have fulfilled them in condemning him.
So what else is important on the Sabbath? It's important to be able to read the Word of God. That's another thing that is essential, a special reading on the Sabbath. And Rose, what else?
And on the Sabbath we went out of the city by a riverside, where prayer was wont to be made. And we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither.
We find here that it's also important to commune with God in nature, to go out into nature and hear the Word of God. And finally, Brother Joe, what should we be determined to do as a people? We go back to the verse we read at the very beginning.
And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in.
So last week and this week, I hope that we have had a chance to learn a little bit about the responsibilities that we have during the Sabbath hours, to be able to worship God and to praise Him, and to take time away from our busy schedules and to be refreshed.